Pine tree 50, 60 years ago was just a seedling. The house contains 12 rooms, and 8 of them which were in use all the time we lived here. We had a room for hired man. Every farm at that time had a hired man, and our place was no exception. We had a hired man, and he had his own quarters, and these were some of the happiest years of my life. At the time we bought the Bates place, we also bought with it the Quabog Spring, which will be probably the focus of this presentation this morning. Later on, we'll take a trip down to where the Quabog Spring was, and we'll show you how the spring is today, and I'll try to bring you up to date on what the spring looked like when we worked there. The same as it was then, except that it needs painting compared to what it was then. This was the garage part of it, garage, and the barn at the time we lived here was fairly new. The barn was only about 30 or 40 years old, and we didn't have very many cows at that time. We only had about 18 or 20, and we had a pasture for them down on the side of the road between here and South Main Street, and we had a gate that opened from the pasture portion across the road, and the gate that is down at the foot of this incline here, and we opened the gate halfway and let the cattle come up through a runway which was on the other side of this stone wall. The barnyard. The barnyard occupies the portion where you see a boarded window and then into the cow barn. The barn is 100 feet long, and of course we cut a lot of hay, and we had hay fork. We had what was known as a gravel fork, and used to have a trolley that ran the top of the barn at the very peak of the barn, and had a trolley arrangement to pull the hay fork along and dump the hay into the proper bays where we wanted it. Another distinguishing point that I well remember is the condition of the gates. At the time we moved down here, the farm hadn't been used as a farm for 10 or a dozen years, and the barn was in relatively good condition, and as I had said before, the barn was only 20 or 30 years old, and it hadn't been used as a farm for quite some time. It had been used by an absentee farmer who maintained the place for the Bateses. The Bates family at that time consisted of Mrs. Bates, P.C. Bates' widow, and she had a grown daughter, Tryphosa. They lived in Worcester, 29 Harvard Street. And Mrs. Bates, I well remember when we bought the place, we gave her a lifetime permission to get what spring water she wanted for her own personal use from the spring. And of course, she was elderly, she didn't drive, and she had a black chauffeur, David Anderson by name. He had, at the time the Bates family lived here, he lived down at the next house below us. You can see that little house facing this way. That's where the colored chauffeur lived. At the time, was the Bates family was in residence here. And when they lived in Worcester, he used to drive her out from Worcester with an old Chevrolet panel truck, and he used to load up with spring water, and we used to help him load up. The spring stands out in my mind because that was my source of spending money while I was in the high school years. And I started driving when I was about 14, and even before I had a license, I used to deliver spring water uptown. And I remember one occasion, there was a ball game or something, and Steve Quill was chief of police then, and he was standing in the middle of the intersection at Main Street and School Street directing traffic, and making the turn. I almost ran over his feet. He didn't, he wasn't very pleased about that. In fact, he called up my father and told him that keep his boy off the street until he got a license. And we, cowboys we call them, they are commonly known as demi-johns or whatever. But these, there's a sample of one up in the museum, a 5-gallon glass tub. And we used to sell them uptown. We delivered spring water to both of the banks and the rubber shop office, the asbestos office, brown shoe office. We even used to deliver some spring water uptown in front of Howard's store. Howard's store, which is on Main Street in the Town Hall block at that time. And Hannigan's Express used to pick up maybe sometimes 8 or 10 carboys of water that they delivered in Worcester. We still had customers in Worcester. Now, as we proceed down to the spring, I'll continue in more with my memories of the spring as it was back in the 1920s and early 30s. Those were the days long before power mowers and so forth. And that lawn, I had to mow with a push mower, and I'm telling you, that was no little chore back in those days. One of the features that I hadn't spoken of before, the hydrants here. At the time we lived here, both of the hydrants, the hydrant on this side of the house and the hydrant over at the other side of the house near the first pole after the mailbox, there's a hydrant over there. They used to be a little house around each one of the hydrants because Mr. T.C. Bates, who originally owned the place, was instrumental in the water commission, and as a favor to him, the water commissioners had a little lean-to, a little house around each one of the hydrants. And inside the hydrant was, inside the box, was a length of hose, a nozzle, and a wrench for turning on the hydrant. Along this knoll here, as I had said before, there was a board fence and there were cherry trees. I believe that one tree that is left is one of the original cherry trees. There were 3 different varieties of cherries. There were a light sweet yellow cherry, 2 trees. There was 2 trees of dark red sour cherries my mother used to make pies from. And there was another tree of black cherries. They were very good. And I remember during the cherry season, my sisters and I would spend maybe a couple hours at a time perched in one of the trees, filling ourselves with cherries. Now we'll go down toward the spring. There is not much left of the original spring building. Now, as you can see from the road from Bate Street, from near the access road to the spring. At the time we lived here, there was a well-defined road down to the spring, because it was in constant use, so we kept it pretty well conditioned. The level of the water in the actual spring is probably as high as it ever was, because you can see the water flowing out of the overflow. That overflow is about halfway between the top and bottom of the concrete box which enclosed the spring itself. The dimensions of that concrete box were probably 8 feet by 6 feet, 8 feet long by 6 feet wide. The bottom of the spring itself was covered by a copper wire mesh, probably a half-inch square, and covered with a layer of about 2 or 2.5 inches of marble pebbles. These marble pebbles had to be cleaned every 3 or 4 years because they would become coated with anyway, we would periodically pump out the spring until the water was down, so that my father or someone else could get in with a pair of rubber boots and shovel all these stones to one side, and then sweep them with a heavy broom until they're nice and clean and white again, and then we shovel the pebbles to the other side of the spring and clean the rest of it. And that overflow run through a clay pipe down to a point probably 40 feet away in an area which is now overgrown with brush and at that time was open just like the rest of the field. And that overflow was in another box, maybe 4 by 4 feet, with a cover on it, and we could check it periodically without having to go into the spring itself to see what the condition was, how the water was flowing. But the water was constantly flowing about 5 gallons a minute, and we could determine whether or not that the source of the water was drying up or whatever. But apparently the source never did dry up, because we always had sufficient flow, and according to the analysis of the water, this was determined to have its source somewhere up in the White Mountains. It was determined through analysis that this had the lowest mineral content of any spring water in this area. And in fact, the catalog that the Bates family put out at the height of its popularity claimed that it had the lowest mineral content of any spring water in America. And in fact, this booklet that Mr. Bates put out shows a comparison of the analysis of various other competitive spring water companies. In fact, at one time we had sent a sample of a spring water to Worcester Tech. At that time, Harry Feldman, who was a native of this town, was a professor of chemistry down there, and he had written a glowing letter telling us that that was the purest natural spring water that they had ever had the pleasure of making an analysis of. At the time of its greatest popularity, the Quabog Spring Water Company had offices in New York even, and part of the booklet here shows a picture of the then President of the United States, William Howard Taft, with a bottle of the Quabog spring water prominently displayed on the table in front of him. I don't think that Mr. Bush would probably be interested now, but at that time, as I say, we had some popularity around town at least, and it was too bad to see the state of disrepair that the springs was falling into. One of the methods of selling the water was by these gallon bottles. We used to sell 6-gallon bottles in what we called a well, it was just a plain box, wooden box that contained 6 of these, and these had a sleeve of Excelsior and paper around them, and fit into the box. And we used to sell 6 of these for 40 cents, compared with 50 cents for a 5-gallon bottle. And this is a sample of the labels that we put on these bottles, Quabog spring water. And we have here another advertising gimmick, if you want to call it that. These were the corkscrews that we put one of these corkscrews into each one of these boxes of, we used to call it a case. Somebody called up for water, and we asked if they wanted a carboy or a case. A case meant 6 of these bottles, and each case we put one of these corkscrews in.
What it claims to do, George. George?
At the time that Mr. Bates was actively running the company, he did extensive advertising, even in the New York papers. And this is a sample. This is a picture of one of the labels, and this is one of the advertising piece of material that he put out. Spring water, a specific for and cures indigestion, dyspepsia, la grippe, rheumatism, insomnia, malaria, gravel, and all troubles of the kidneys and bladder. It's one of the most simple and effective agents for purifying the blood.
Believe it or not.
If we could put it on sale now, we'd make $1 million probably.
I think you did a super job.
Yeah, you did very good. I think one next first. Not doing. That's right. Maybe I made it different. Camera make it look good. It's pretty when it's all green. Right now, just right there.
After we sold the farm, including the spring, in the summer of 1932, the place was taken over by a family named Lux from New Braintree. After only a couple of years or so, they sold the place again to the Crockwell Wendemuth family. The Wendemuth family. The Wendemuth family had possession of the farm for up until, well, not too distant past, when the farm was sold to Mr. Duranian. And what is the correct pronunciation? Duranian.
Yes.
And this while for a while the sale of the spring water was taken over by Mr. Crockwell. Mr. Crockwell lived in the house next to the Bates homestead. He was a brother-in-law. He was brother of Mrs. What's her name? Sister? Wendemuth's sister. He was a brother-in-law of the Wendemuths, and he sold the spring water for some years. And in recent years, the spring has just fallen into disrepair. And as far as the Quabog Spring Water Company is concerned, we might as well consider it dissolved. But there is hope that
What years? We want to know what years. Okay.
as I believe, the Bates family was actively involved in the Quabog Spring Water Company from probably the 1880s up to possibly as early as the 1900s. Since that time, there was a period of probably 20 years or so that the spring was not actively engaged as such until we took it over in 1922, and from 1922 to 32 we were actively engaged in the sale of the spring water. I was engaged in delivering it as part of my spending money, and since 1932 the Windemiths were engaged in selling the spring water along with garden produce, and then in the late 50s, 60s, or early 70s, Mr. Cropwell took over the sale of the spring water, and in the last several years it's just fallen to disuse. This area around here was a lot drier than it seems to be now. In fact, we always cut hay or grew corn here. We usually had corn on this lower part and just hay on the higher elevation. This brook that runs through here, you can see where there are crossovers. They are signaled by the two stones. That signifies bridges over the waterway. This water originates up somewhere up around the center of North Brookfield, and it crosses Spring Street and ultimately down across to Evergreen and Winter Streets, and flows through Bates property through what we used to use as the pasture out across Bates Street, and then from where that barway, the access to the spring, it flows in a walled up brook, you might as well call it, through fields and out to the top of the hill, and then it follows on the southeast side of 8th Street that leads down the hill and thence down to almost down to the West Brookfield line.
What about the stones that were whitewashed?
These stones that you probably see, at the time we bought the house, were all nicely whitewashed, and they stood out in the landscape, and of course there were no bushes or weeds or anything growing up in the land in the area of the brook. It was all good tillable land. The barn at that time was in very good repair. The shingles that you see on the lower part of the back part of the barn weren't there at that time. The bottom half was all bricked up, and there was at one time we found in the basement area of the barn a large grindstone, and it was engraved with the name T. Nye, N-Y-E. And the date, 1814. So I imagine that was left from one of the previous owners of the land. The land in back of the barn, as I've said before, was named for the family who the Bates family had bought from the Nye family. And Mr. Bonham Nye was a well-known surveyor and map maker at that time, and also prominent in town politics. All the way back to the grove, there was a fence that, well, you can see remnants of the wall there, and